Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session. The theme of the conference, as you can see, is towards a new model of boards of directors. I am John Almandoz. I'm a professor here, but the protagonists are the speaker and discussant, Ruth Aguilera and Amir Licht. The topic of the discussion is unintended consequences of shareholder activism, which is a very important topic because it's growing exponentially and is bringing greater discipline to organizations to address ESG concerns that in some cases they are perceived as interferences and unwelcome distractions in some cases, but it's also doing a lot of good in many ways. We're going to hear about a socio-cognitive perspective on how corporations respond to those shareholder pressures. The speaker is Ruth Aguilera, who is a Harvard sociologist and is now the Distinguished Darlan Frederick Brodsky Trustee Professor in Global Businesses at Northeastern University. She's an expert in comparative corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, among other things. And the discussant is Amir Licht, Professor of Reichman University in Tel Aviv, who is a specialist and expert in corporate governance, international securities regulation, and the cultural dimension of social institutions, among other things. So Ruth Aguilera will have 25 minutes for her comments, and the discussant will have 20 minutes, but he can take more or less. And then I will be taking questions from you. So if you're a doctor, make sure that you write legibly so I can see your own writing. So Ruth Aguilera, the floor is yours. 25 minutes.
Okay. Well, first of all, good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, John, and thank you, Amir. And also thank you to Professor Beck and Professor Canals and all the organizations of ECGI and IESE. So today I wanted to talk to you about some, it's a following up conversation because 3 years ago, we had a conference here at IESE also on boards and purpose. And today what I wanted to do is to materialize or to kind of put purpose into a strategy through the lens of ESG. So my talk is going to start with some working definitions of what purpose is, which is a word that's out there since now we have a stakeholder capitalism, and so just talk about that. And then I'll share with you a little bit from a paper that I have on how corporate governance can help operationalize, can help activate, put in action purpose. And I will follow that corporate governance going down to the board and thinking about how boards relate to ESG, sustainability, environmental, social, and global. I'll share 2 studies with you that I've done on shareholder proposals. All right, so one of my favorite definitions of corporate purpose is the one from Halbert Joly, who basically says that corporate purpose is the combination of these 4 bubbles. One is what the world needs. The other one is how the company can create economic value. So we're not forgetting about the economic value. And then these 2 other ones, what people in the organization want, and then how people in the organization can contribute. It has to be the combination of all those things. This is a Harvard Business Review article from the CEO of Best Buy that he actually stepped down at some point saying that he was no longer contributing to purpose and wanted other people to have more ideas on how to pursue that. Then there is an academic definition from Professor Colin Meyer at Oxford that says the purpose of business is to produce profitable, financially profitable solutions to problems of people and planet. And in the process, again, he returns to producing profits. All right, so stakeholder capitalism corporate purpose has been criticized as very idyllic, not focused on the sustainability of the firm, both financial and non-financial. I think many of these scholars pay attention to that. So corporate purpose this is a dissertation from somebody at the University of Illinois that is studying really the data. And basically, most of the web pages of the Fortune 500 over the years, they just include what is the purpose of the company, what is the raison d'être of the company, and it's really there, so we have to pay attention to it because The next step is, what are companies doing with that purpose? Okay, so today I'll talk about the two parts. The first part is this blog that I have here. And it's basically, it's a paper that Professor Canals has asked me to talk about, which has to do on how corporate governance, and especially boards, can activate, can materialize corporate purpose. And obviously, that corporate purpose has to come down to the strategy of the firm. So here, this is a paper that was published a year ago. And basically, what I do in this paper that is thinking about what is the company trying to achieve. Obviously, any board needs to revisit that. And again, you know, Professor Licht will talk about it. Unlike the legal scholars, the strategy scholars can have the luxury of being a lot more dynamic. We can revisit. What is the company trying to do? How is the company trying to be sustainable, right? So the first thing is have a very good definition of a very good identity, a very good agreement on what is the company trying to achieve, and then who develops that purpose? Who is coming up with that achievement definition? Then the next thing is for whom the company is managed. Once we have, you know, for whom are we doing this? And in strategy, we have a lot of research on that. Research that once value is created, how do you distribute that value not only with the shareholders, but also with all the other stakeholders? And again, just reemphasizing this point, that in a strategy, because we worry about competitiveness and sustainability, you know, long-term sustainability of the firm, that is a dynamic process, right? It changes, it can be revisited, it can be updated, it can be innovative. So other questions that we talk about that I think are important, especially like as we see it, you know, in the US and in Europe and in other parts of the world, you know, how do owners can influence purpose? How the rights of these owners might change, might be different across different countries. And basically, like, when we talk about corporate purpose, the corporate governance in there is about these 3 points. How are within the organization, power relations distributed? Who decides, who has the authority, who has the legitimation? Purpose relationships. How do you align the purpose with the incentives, with the time horizons, with the corporate strategy? And then how do you strengthen that corporate governance with accountability and trust? And here I'm just going to put a plug for Professor Canals that has a wonderful book that was published in 2022 called Boards of Directors in Disruptive Times. And in that book, he talks a lot about the long-term strategic view of boards, as well as the role of purpose within boards. So in a nutshell, for this first part, I really see the board as the linchpin, as the connection between the corporate purpose, what the firm is trying to do, and the strategy. How are we going to implement that? How does it look for the different levels within the organization? And you know, the firm strategy and practices need to be anchored clearly within the notion of purpose as well. So it's a two-way arrow. Okay, so let me switch to another part, because when we talk, so here I'm coming back to the same graph. When we talk about boards of directors obviously are very much influenced by who the owners are, how much power the owners have, and within this, now there is a race, this has been, you know, a real race of shareholder activists, right, within the shareholders. And obviously, these activists are very interested in influencing some of the strategies of the firm, and this refers to the first part of my talk. The strategy of the firm is related to the corporate purpose. All right, so I have these 2 studies with a graduate student from Granada who came and visited me in Boston, and 2 professors. And basically, what we are doing is we are looking at ESG performance as the enactment of corporate purpose. Like, it could be another thing, but we're looking precisely at environmental, social, and governance. And we are looking at how can shareholders influence the board so that the board sets the strategic direction of ESG. It could be R&D, it could be internationalization, it could be many different things, but we're looking at ESG as is closely aligned with purpose. So shareholders can engage in many different ways. They can be owners, they can do shareholder proposals, they can have private engagement. In these studies, we're going to focus on shareholder proposals. So these are proposals that shareholders, they could have $4,000, like the Starbucks current activists, $4,000 in Starbucks, and they can do a proposal that has to be voted in the annual shareholder meeting. So we're going to look at two parts. The first part is the rest part. How come that these shareholder proposals, that as many of you know, usually they get rejected at the annual general meeting, how come that they keep putting proposals? Does it have any effect on the strategies of the firm? So that's the red part. And on the second part, we're going to look at proposals that they have been withdrawn, that they have been not taken to the annual general meeting. So the study one looks at all the proposals, and this data here is US data from IESE. And the study one looks at all the proposals that have been proposed for the last 14 years. And the green part here shows us those that they're accepted. So between the S&P 1500, only 2% are accepted. The rest are rejected. And this data here that and most of them get rejected, okay? So really the intriguing question is, how come that shareholders keep submitting proposals when they get rejected by the company? Do they have any effect at all on performance or on something, right? So that's the first study. And the second study, which is possibly even more interesting, is those that the shareholder puts a proposal, like the one that we saw recently at the Starbucks, and then they have a side dialogue with the board, with the company, sometimes with the top management team as well, and then they withdraw the proposal because they reach some sort of agreement. In the case of Starbucks, they reach a labor agreement on what's going to happen with employees. So I'll discuss briefly these two, okay? So again, so over the years, the number of proposals have been quite stable. So we have around 800 proposals in the S&P 500. So companies tend to receive more than one. And I guess the interesting thing in the data here is that there's been a switch from governance proposals to more environmental and social proposals, all right, so over the years. Among the S&P 500, the approval proposed, so the proposals that have been submitted and they get approved is 11%. Among the S&P 500 S&P 1500 is 2%, is lower. What does it mean this? So let me put an example here. So this is a shareholder proposal that was submitted to Alphabet, and this organization, which is an organization that's concerned about privacy and teenagers accessing digital information, they want Alphabet to have more analysis of the risk of the well-being of teenagers. And they're telling the company, you know, we want you to have a risk analysis about that because it can affect the reputation of the company, it can affect the financial health of the company. And as we see here in 91.6, this was rejected 91.6. Another example is a very well-known activist group, which is called Follow This. They're mostly focused on oil and gas. And basically, they're telling BP, we need you to do a better plan, a strategic plan on how you are going to meet the net zero 2050 standards. So adapt greenhouse emission reduction targets. Again, this was 83.3 against this proposal, right? So really the question is, why they keep submitting, because last year it was the record submission of proposals. Why do they keep submitting? Does it have any effect on the ESG performance of these firms? And so we take a sample of the paper is written, so I'm happy to share, I'm sure it's going to be shared, but we take a sample of the S&P 500 firms. So there's a typo here from 2006 to 2022. We do fixed effects, lots of controls on different things that the companies could be affected for. And we look at the ESG performance from many different ways, but we take this one from Aecon, but we also use other robustness to measure the non-financial performance of these firms. So just to reiterate, what we're doing is, there are these shareholders that do proposals and forcing the companies to change some ESG practices in the firm. And then we're looking 1 year, 2 years later, is there any effect on this firm's non-financial performance? Is there any effect on how the ESG, does it improve at all, right? So we find that there is a very strong positive relationship between the number of proposals and the performance, the non-financial performance afterwards. Very strong relationship. Then we ask, is this, so how, we kind of break it down. Are these proposals more governance? Are these proposals more environmental and social? This is the E and the S. And we find that when companies submit governance proposals, the governance improve. And when companies submit environmental and social proposals, the performance improves. So basically here is an example of Goldman Sachs had 13 governance proposals demanding independence, and we see that 1 year and 2 years after, the governance performance, not necessarily on board independence, but the overall governance performance of that company, Goldman Sachs, improves. Similarly, when we look at, this is environmental mostly, not so much social, the case of Home Depot. Home Depot had 54 environmental and social proposals. We look 1 year, 2 years later, the overall performance in their environmental and sustainability and social items in this index also improves. The most interesting part of this paper is this relationship. Do we see some companies that they have governance proposals? That's what we find. Some companies have governance proposals, and then we see the environmental and social improve, not so much the governance. And this is something that maybe we can talk about later, and this would be the case of Colgate. They have a lot more governance proposals. They don't move much the needle in the governance performance, but they really improve the environmental in this case. I can talk more about this in the discussion, but one of the arguments that we have is that corporate governance, especially among these S&P 500 firms in the United States, has really advanced a lot, and it's quite settled. So these proposals that we see tend to be more outliers, more difficult to move the needle, such as changing dual-class shares, such as in the US, separating the CEO and the chairman of the board. So they can really not move the needle there, and then they change something that is easier to change, which is improve their greenhouse emissions, right? So this is especially the case when firms when firms are at risk of environmental reputation, when firms are in the blacklist for having violated some environmental issues. So we can talk more about this. Okay, so let me just talk briefly about study 2. So study 2, we call it shadow activism. And this has also been called private activism. And this study is actually 25% of the proposals that they are submitted. And so it's not a non-trivial amount. And again, this is probably, you could be maybe a more civilized, definitely more engagement with the board. And these are an example. For instance, this. After filing, we seek to negotiate an agreement to withdraw the proposal. So they file, but the goal is really to withdraw the proposal on terms that advance our objectives with the company. Objectives with the company that they are defined by the strategy, that they are defined by the corporate purpose of the company. They have to all be aligned. And to lead to a more collaborative dialogue, right? So they are trying not to get to the annual general meeting vote. Another one here, this is another quite active shareholder, socially responsible shareholder, and they say, our most successful shareholder resolutions, the same as shareholder proposals, may never make it to the printed proxy statement, but instead are withdrawn upon the achievement of meaningful agreements with the engaged companies, right? So they put a seed, they started dialogue, and then they withdraw. They don't want to get to the annual general meeting. And obviously, there has to be an agreement. So what we find, and here, remember, so what we find is that when there are shareholder proposals that they are withdrawn, a year and 2 years later, we found that there is an improvement, again, in the corporate social performance of those firms, okay? It means that, so let me tell you two more things about this. One is going to be about who submits these proposals, and the other one is going to be about the board. Okay, so excuse this regression here that I guess, so who submits this proposal? So what we find is that when the proposal is submitted, I would say, by a reasonable investor, such as an SRI fund, such as Calvert, Trillium, like really reasonable investor, asset manager, usually, and this proposal is withdrawn, usually the performance, the social performance, the social environmental performance of the firm improves. And so it's this one that we have here, SRI, right? SRI funds, the performance improves afterwards. If it's withdrawn by a union, such as FAL, or so if it's withdrawn from a union, so a union has, in the US, as you know, unions are not very powerful, but there are some that actually have quite a lot of teeth. So, especially because it's huge pensions and huge funds. If it's proposed if it's submitted by a union and withdrawn, it also has positive effect on the social environmental performance of the firm. However, if it's proposed by what is called special interests, and I don't know, PETA is People for the Protection of Animals. I don't remember exactly. No, protection of. So if it's from PETA, that was the McDonald's, the pigs, pregnant pigs, or as you saw, so these are a special interest that they are more aggressive. Those actually have a negative effect on the performance, on the environmental and social performance. And we can talk about that, but I think it has to do with the disclosure, how they are forced to disclose other things, and then it turns negative. Another huge actor in this is what's called the gadflies. And, so they're well known, like John Chevedden has submitted more than 1,000 proposals. And despite all the noise in the media and all the noise, these guys have no effect whatsoever. Boards ignore them. It's entertaining, but it's really a waste of time. Evelyn Davis just recently passed away, but she was a huge activist for 20 years. All right, so two more things here. So what's the role of the board in all these, right? Because these proposals arrive to the company, the boards have to deal with it. What's the role of the boards? So we find three things. On this positive relationship, we said if the proposal is withdrawn, in general, they reach some kind of agreement that improves the non-financial performance of firms. Okay, so what affects that from the board point of view? So we find three things. First, the higher the financial slack, so this is not surprising. The richer the company, the more liquidity that the company has, the more positive this relationship. Okay, like they have more latitude to really change and improve things. Here we look at board interlocks, and we have to explore more of these, but basically what we find is that companies that have high social capital, which we measure by board interlocks, so those companies tend to strengthen these positive relationships. We explain that in terms of the experience of these board members that comes from other boards. Up to a point, there's a point that it declines because these individuals tend to be too busy to pay attention and entertain these activists. And finally, and interestingly, we find that boards without sustainability committees tend to strengthen that relationship. So boards that have a sustainability committee, it's a substitute. And that's an interesting finding in the sense that in that case, if there is not a sustainability committee, then they can more directly address these shareholder activists, okay? So just to close, let me just bring you today to some of the things that are happening today in shareholder activism, and especially since we're here in Madrid, there's a huge contrast between the US and Europe in terms of the activism. But most interestingly, and my clock is, the clock here, I have a clock, no, you don't have a, so most interestingly is the anti-ESG movement, especially from the large asset managements that lately they are voting against ESG proposals. So that's like one thing coming up. This is something that we might discuss later. In Europe, we're seeing a lot more shareholder activism, either coming from the UK into Spain, or coming from Switzerland, a lot, especially in Germany. There's a lot more shareholder activism. And, again, the rise of the anti-ESG proposals in the US, they are basically from these two organizations. It's called the National Center for Public Policy Research and the National Legal and Policy Center. These two centers it's very interesting to read their proxies and their language in how they argue against an ESG proposal, absolutely the contrary on financial terms, right? And especially a lot to do with China these days. So I'll just finish with 2 slides of things that are happening, and these are just 2 examples, but kind of it seems like new trends that they're happening within shareholder activism. The first one, it's called invisible activism. I don't know how many of you have followed, I have alluded to this. One of the largest consortiums of unions is called a Strategic Organizing Center, put a proposal to Starbucks that they needed better labor rights for their employees. And then Starbucks board negotiated with SOC, with this union organization, to withdraw and start talking with, and trying to improve their labor conditions. So here, I guess the really interesting thing is to follow up and see whether there is actually some action into this, right? But this is the withdrawn that they have studied and that we hope to see a positive effect on these demands. The next level of activism that, and here we have a lawyer. The next level of activism is about the litigation, right? Professor Licht will talk about this. And basically, there are some organizations, especially in the United States, that they are getting sick of these activities, and they're saying it's enough. I don't care if you withdraw, I'm going to sue you. And this is the case of these Follow This and Arjuna Capital that put a proposal on Exxon, and Exxon said, and they said, so they put a proposal on Exxon, and what they did, Exxon, after they withdraw the proposal, Exxon has already initiated a lawsuit against them, right? And that's the last thing that these funds want, because it's a very expensive litigation. But it's a way for them to deter and repeal these attacks. But this is definitely the next level of escalation in the shareholder activism. And we'll see how many other large companies follow suit with this, and it might deter some small funds, some activists that they're trying to change ESG, trying to change the strategy of the firm, trying to change the corporate purpose of the firm through strategy and ESG. So with that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Amir, the floor is yours. Thank you. And by the way, feel free to bring the questions that you have to me. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I would like to open, I'm just waiting for my slides to come up, thank you. What I would actually like to open with is my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Canals and Miriam Fecha for not just the hospitality, but the genuine support that I felt. Thank you so much. Let's go to business. I'll be discussing just the first paper, which I think is the key to understanding Ruth's project. The paper, just in one line, asks a simple question. How do firms respond to shareholders' activism with regard to governance issues versus environmental and social issues, ENS, and why? Okay, so we saw the pattern, but the real question is, why do they do that? And the thing that you'll tell your friends or your children, why did you stay away from the office or from home on this morning? The line is simple. Activism activates everything, right? It's like in the movie, everything, everywhere, all at once. More specifically, when they look at S&P 500 firms, when shareholder activism focuses on governance, well, governance performance, or at least scores of governance performance rise the year after. but ENS scores, or ENS performance, as proxied by these scores, also rises the year after. However, when shareholder activism focuses on ENS issues, guess what? The year after, scores on ENS go up, but scores on governance also go up, non-significantly, but positively so. So everything rises as a result of activism. The real question is, why is that the case? The story, the theory, the argument, the model, it really depends on the style that you want to describe it. But it's basically a story. What goes on out there? The story, or the analytical framework, is social cognitive theory that the authors advance in order to expand like the classic theory of stakeholder theory, Freeman's stakeholder theory or strategic approach to management. It's an enhancement. It's something that should tell us more, give us more information or a deeper understanding of the fundamental mechanism of stakeholder theory. And the key component here is bounded rationality of board members, right? That's the key ingredient, the extra thing.
Yes.
How does this work? By emphasizing everything. Now, you see the contradiction, right? You cannot emphasize everything. But this is exactly what we see in the result. Something happens, everything is being emphasized. Why? Because of bounded rationality, because of reliance on heuristics, and I'll talk about this in a moment. And at the societal level, or the social context of this action, or these responses, or board response to shareholder activism, lies also a social construct, or a social mechanism. The idea is that boards get activated by this shareholder activism in order to appease or to conform with generally expected social norms or ideas, or seeking legitimacy, and so on. So we have like an individual component and there's a social component. A few words about the findings. In 2 words, first of all, well done, 2 words. Absolutely fascinating. These are the more important two words. So the paper provides or uses a very simple yet rich enough setting. We just heard about it. And it delivers a crisp and very clear presentation of the results. We saw that as well. And the nice thing about this paper is that at the same time, the findings are both surprising. I mean, I didn't expect to see that, but also plausible. So it doesn't give you a sense, that can't be true. You need to look better into your data. It's a perfect match for this conference, right? If you want to develop a new model of the board, if you want to improve your own board, you want to know how the thing works in the inside, right? Under the hood. How boards might think, how do they think about stakeholders, that would allow you to design strategy or to design the designing of new strategy by a new model of a board. Think, right? That's the message. Things, the stakeholders look you in the eye and they tell you, think about what you're trying to do to me. That's the idea. And then they get activated and they respond. Some quibbles, because we're academics, okay? It's inevitable. At the technical level, everything happens too quickly. Everything, everywhere, all at once, but rather quickly. In 1 year, there's a very strong response. It's not that I don't believe the results, I actually love them, but we would like to know what happens 2 years after, 3 years after, maybe on a 3-year average following this shareholder activism proposal. More substantively, I think Ruth has already addressed this point, it's not equally clear in the paper itself. Is it really shareholder activism? It turns out that it's not, right? Some of the shareholder activists are really the gadflies. These are like tiny pestering shareholders. Boards don't take them into account. I mean, they ignore them. But there are serious shareholders there who are actually stakeholders or stakeholder activists in disguise. I mean, shareholder proposal is just the vehicle, it's just the platform, it's just the mechanism, but it's not about shareholders. It's not about shareholders' interests, not about what's important for shareholders. It's what's important for stakeholders. They're broadly defined. And I think that would not change the results, but it would change the interpretation of the results. It would change the framework, the framing of the story. I was asking, can you check that? You have already checked that. More of that, more detailed, actually showing that those shareholders or activists are actually stakeholder activists wearing a hat of a shoulder in order to access the general meeting. More importantly, perhaps, is the theory, right? The way we think, the way we analyze what's happening here. And it's about how directors think. That's the key question for any model of corporate governance, any model of boards, hence the contribution of this paper to our knowledge about the working of the board. I think that it's key to understanding corporate governance, also key to understanding law and how law may or may not regulate the working of a board. So the framework is the socio-cognitive theory, again, 2 components. The socio here stands for the societal level of analysis, right? The boards along the story work against a shared meaning and norms, shared meanings and norms like a common understanding, common knowledge. This is plausible, yet I think in the theory that you draw on by Rindova and her co-authors, I think it's a bit understructured. Now, it's not a weakness of this particular paper because it's like a single country paper. It's like a within US analysis, so you don't expect to see much variation, if at all, in terms of commonly held ideas and norms. The more action or the more traction, the more interesting stuff takes place at the individual level, the cognitive component of the socio-cognitive theory. That's the individual level. And here the authors, again, drawing on the work of Rindova et al., they focus on bounded rationality. The idea here is that, managers are human, believe it or not. That's the theory. That's the discovery. We're all human, including managers. So we have limited attention spans. We are boundedly rational. We have, human cognitions. We have human intuitions, and we have emotions. And we use this in a human way, meaning we draw on heuristics, we cut corners, we think quick in order to get the decision. Well, this draws on a very solid body of academic work by the late Daniel Kahneman, by Gerd Gigerenz on the use of heuristics and bounded rationality. It draws on Herbert Simon's work on satisficing, on reaching reasonable, good enough decisions and then moving on the work of mainly on the work of Keith Stanovich on System 1 and System 2 models of thinking. The quibble that I have in this regard is that this sounds somewhat unlikely in the context of board strategy making and decision making with regard to stakeholders. So the use of heuristics, the cutting corners, is based on System 1. Quick, autonomous processes, effortless, inaccurate, but very efficient in terms of cognitive resources, the use of cognitive resources. In S&P 500 firms, these are large companies dealing with, handling major, important strategic decisions. You expect to have some deliberation. You expect to have reasonably informed decisions. That's also key from the legal point of view in order to get the protection of the business judgment rule. A board needs to go through certain motions of informing itself, deliberating over different alternatives, and then reaching a decision, and then it doesn't matter for the lawyers, right? That's the business judgment idea. So somehow it doesn't connect, at least to my again intuition. I think you may want to look at the substance of some of the decisions. So if the decisions look to you, if you look in some of the examples that you gave, like half rational, half baked, too quick, that could support that kind of mechanism. Perhaps you could challenge it. Okay? A few more words. In future work, not in that particular paper, neither in the companion one, but in future or in another companion work, you may want to expand the theoretical framework. How so? At the individual level, I think, that's my personal inclination, you may want to consider motivational factors. So the question is, what makes them tick? Them meaning you, right? What drives directors at the individual level? Okay? At the intersection of cognition and cognitive factors and motivational factors lies a field of research called, or a notion of cognitive style. For instance, there's a need for cognitive closure. Work by Ariko Glansky. I wrote a little bit about it in terms of review, by way of review on this. The idea is that when people, including managers, when they face complex decisions, they would do something, anything, just to get the decision over with and move on. Okay, there's a need for closure, which lies out there. Does it play a role in the context of these decisions? I don't know. It's, again, work that could be done in the future. I would look at values, okay? Values at the individual level. There's very important work by Aguilera et al. There's joint work by myself with Renee Adams and another piece with Lilach Sagiv from Hebrew U. That's an opportunity to say a very warm thank you to Ruth. We have benefited from comments by Ruth. What are values? Values are ideas, abstract ideas, conceptions of the desirable. What's good, what's right, what's legitimate, and people in general, and managers in particular, use values in order to assess decisions, rank them, judge them, and legitimate or find lack of legitimacy, and then make a choice, right? I would also consider, again, not in this work because the data does not lend itself to this kind of analysis, heterogeneity. Not all board members are the same. So the paper talks about firms, how firms respond. And the idea is that the firm, through the board, responds to a particular shareholder. But that's not the case, right? It's a group of people. It's a team. And people are heterogeneous. So this is my favorite cartoon. I apologize to those of you who have already seen it, but I try to stick it whenever I can. You have here, it's the CEO or the chairman of the board, and on his desk there's this ESG, the typical ESG booklet. You can see A Better World Together. There's like a famished child and a green tree. And he's desperate, saying, why, lamenting, why? Why do I have to care when I don't? I don't. And his deputy there says, there, come along, old chap. Of course you don't care. Now pull yourself together. Now that's a caricature, right? It's a joke. There are some people who are just like that, but not all of them. And the board is a mix of people. Again, this figure is taken from work with Renee. We were able to actually rank board members in terms of their individual level of shareholderism. How much do they personally think that shareholders are the more important constituency in the firm in terms of strategic purpose versus stakeholders? Turns out that they're normal. Right? There are a few sociopaths like the guy from the cartoon all the way there, very, very shareholderist, like extreme shareholderist. There are people who are extreme stakeholderist, but they're the tails of the distribution. Most of the board members that we survey are right there in the middle. They could side with shareholders, they could side with stakeholders, depending on the context. They could see differences. And what's really important here is that you could observe differences across individual board members. And that's important in order to treat the board and to develop a model of the board when you take into account the moving parts in it, which are, the people who are the moving parts in that board. A few words about the societal level. Norms are very important. Social norms, social expectations. Boards design, form strategy in light of social expectations. They get feedback all the time from the media. Shareholder meetings are just part of the feedback mechanisms that put pressure on boards. That's basically the idea behind the stakeholder theory by Freeman. And you may want to expand, again, in the future about what kind of mechanisms are at work there in terms of responding to social norms. For instance, there's very nice theoretical work by Claudine Gartenberg and Todd Zenger, essentially showing, not talking about purpose, showing that, or theorizing, that boards exercise power. This is what boards do. Boards have power. They are the center of power in any corporation, big or small. They exercise power in light of shared ideas and shared norms of justice. They draw legitimacy, and they draw on the legitimacy of the compliance with ideas, with shared ideas, with justice, in order to get the strategy, to form strategy and to get it enacted on. At a higher level, there's culture. So, cultural norms moderate. This is something that we, Renee Adams and I, have found in our work. They moderate the individual factors of values, but this is something that you can observe only if you use an international setting, which again, if you use a within-country setting like Ruth and her colleagues' paper, you cannot observe this unless you might want to look into regional differences. So, Northeast US versus West Coast US could have observable differences in terms of social norms within US cultural norms and so on. There's some data could be fascinating. So to conclude, it's a very valuable contribution on a key question of corporate governance, on strategy formation, on the working of boards. How do they respond to stimuli from the outside? It points to something that I think is very, very important, individual-level psychology and the role of social norms. So the idea is not just what boards do, what boards decide, but how do they do what they do, how do they do their thing, how do they reach decisions, and how they might think about stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. Would you like to respond to some of his questions?
Well, thank you so much for such a thorough and careful reading of the paper. I really appreciate. So maybe I'll just make 3 points. So the first point is on the shareholder activism versus, I think it's, as you rightly say, I think it's like a very good point, that it's more about a stakeholder activism. It's more about the shareholders representing some stakeholders. So I think that's a great point. Then Professor Licht was talking about the socio-cognitive theory, and the way, so he focused more on the bounded rationality, but the way that we explain this in the paper is that usually traditionally companies have been very concerned about prioritizing the stakeholders and then deciding which stakeholders they're going to attend to. So depending on the, what is more what is a priority, the employees or the suppliers, and what we argue in this paper, based on more macro level work, is that companies are also very concerned about this, how they are evaluated, and we call that socio-cognitive. So how they are evaluated by stakeholders, not only the employees or the suppliers, but more broadly. And we call that socio-cognitive. And the evaluation, so it's basically the evaluation from society of the company. And they care, why do they care about that? They care about that because the reputation of the firm might be a very, very big part of their assets. And therefore, they might not be, so issues of environmental reputation, of social reputation, might have an effect on the financial performance. So that's how we bring in that they don't not only care about that immediate or that prioritized or primary stakeholder, but they might care more broadly how society evaluates them, as potential, and how that spills over into investors. So that's the second point. And then the third point about the motivation. I think it's super important to understand, what is the motivation for decisions. And in organizational theory, there is this theory called awareness, motivation, and capability, right? And basically, the first thing is that boards, top management teams, they need to be aware that something happens. Then they have to be motivated to act. So do they have the motivation to actually act upon it? And finally, the last step on this theory is that they also have to have the resources, the capability, either the knowledge, the capability to actually not only be aware of it, be interested in acting, but having the resources to do something about it. Because sometimes companies can be resource tight, talent tight, and they might not be able to access. So those are some of the things that we're struggling with, and I really appreciate all your comments. Obviously, for researchers, boards are a black box, so we need to triangulate and get to, analyze the decisions without, really. So we are talking to boards, we're talking to investors, but you never get, the full picture of the. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you. So both of you are experts in comparative corporate governance, and I think you've made comments that suggest that as well. Can you talk about the cultural dimensions that make it more likely that shareholders' proposals will have an impact in organizations and drive positive behavior? Maybe comparing, I guess it's primarily a US phenomenon, but can you talk about how similar goals can be attained also in Spain and other European countries? So the cultural dimensions for both of you.
To start? Well, I would say there's very, from what I've observed and talked to because I sit in both sides of the Atlantic, that I would say culturally there are different rules of engagement, and even the statistics shows that when the proposals get through in Europe, they tend to be more highly accepted. So now this is obviously changing because there's always diffusion of practices. And Germany, especially German firms, they are getting a lot more activism. But we also see, especially the children's investment, the TCI from Chris Horn has already attacked several companies in Spain, Celnex, I think AENA. So they have already attacked with several proposals changing issues, social and environmental. So there is, and as I saw in my slide, it's practices, corporate governance practices travel around the world. So there's definitely a diffusion. But then, as Amir was saying, when we arrive and land in a country, there are also the cultural values of rules of engagement. So I would say, I guess I would almost say more civilized here, maybe because they are smaller communities, more tight communities, as opposed to larger communities in the US. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that, particularly in Spain and in Europe, as we have so many family firms and with so much relevance in our economies, and this is something that we were talking about yesterday, family offices are also being very, very active. So family offices in Europe, through the family corporate purpose, which could be, that the firm survives for many more generations, to contribute to their regions. So family offices also are becoming very involved in the companies that they invest through their portfolio. The same with sovereign wealth funds. That's more in the Middle East. Sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East, they also have a strong voice when they acquire, but a strong voice when they invest. And finally, this is private equity in Europe. It has a different rule of engagement as we would see it in the US. It's more personalized. It's more having a voice on what do they expect from the company. And that goes back to what strategy do we expect, but also what is the purpose of this company? Is the purpose of this company to try to bring more employment into the Madrid region, to try to have these family firms more digitalized, more innovative, biopharma, the same, like more. So I think that's how I would say it's very different, yeah. So Amir, what do you think?
So the thing about culture is that it's huge, right? It's very, very complex. It's very elaborate. We all know that it's out there, but it's very challenging to discuss it, say, seriously as academics or rigorously. It is what we call a latent variable. It's like intelligence in individual people. We know that some people are cleverer than others, others are rather stupid, but in order to measure that, to put a value on it, you need to go through some processes. Culture is the same. We know it's out there. I mean, I believe all of you here, in your professional lives, in business, you know that culture is important, corporate culture is there, companies differ on the, exactly, rules of engagement, how power is exercised in a firm, not to mention international differences. I mean, this is an old issue in the management and business administration literature. The thing about boards is that they're made of individuals. Sometimes they come from a particular country, and then they're culturally homogeneous, and sometimes they're not. So how would you treat like an expatriate, someone who grew up in a different culture? Is he or she just a foreigner and therefore different, and then they need to be enculturated, they need to be educated, they need to be brought into the family, corporate family, and so on? Or can we, or should we, as a board, as a team, what the chairman or the chair of the board should do when the board admits some foreigners for whatever reason, a merger or something else? It's very difficult. It's very difficult, and most people would tell, well, just structure their incentives, give them bonuses, shares, give them something, align their interests with shareholders, with stakeholders, with the Almighty, okay? But just align their financial interests and they'll think properly. Not so. And you know that already. I mean, you don't need us to tell you this much. The key challenge, I think, and this is where the literature is heading, this is where the research is heading, is trying to quantify, trying to measure, trying to structure the role of social institutions, norms, legitimacy, social legitimacy, the kind of thing that animate the results in Ruth's paper, right? The idea is that boards operate in a social context, culture is part of it. You see most of the differences across countries and in international settings, but in large enough countries, even in large enough countries like Spain, North and South and so on, not to mention the United States, you may be able and you may need to be able to take account of these cultural differences.
Very good. You also spoke a little bit about Slack, and I think that's a question also for both of you. And there's limited degree of attention, right, that organizations have and boards of directors have in order to attend to all the different questions that they have in front of them. Can it become like too much of a good thing, right? All these shareholder proposals, all of these pressures that they are receiving. At what point can it be too much, right? And then just focus on the business of business, right? Comment.
Yeah. So I think this comment, thank you for this comment, I think it refers to the information processing capacity, the cognitive capacity that that individuals have to really address different tasks that the board has to pursue, and if this is a distraction, or up to what point is a distraction. So I think, like, clearly this gadflies is a distraction, right? Like, we're here, we're doing serious business, let's not have a clown in the annual general meeting because, so I think that since these issues raised by the shareholders, and this can be very minor shareholders, because actually the threshold is very low for shareholders to submit proposals. But these can be very material and financial risk issues. It can be a very low-cost way to address them and to bring awareness to the board that that's something that is important to that shareholder who often represents stakeholders, because these activists are, as Amir said, they're representing stakeholders, like broader parts of society. So I would say up to a point, but now if companies are fighting back with lawsuits on these small shareholders, then it seems like the conversation is shut. But I don't know what you think about this as a lawyer.
I was just about to say that it's an excellent question, because it's actually broader than just the point that was raised by John, because we hear the same thing about regulation. I mean, there's more and more regulation, and more compliance requirements from firms and boards, the same dozen people who need to address all that. And isn't there too much law, or are there too many shareholder proposals? It's hard to say. I mean, this is why we pay you so much to be board members, right? More seriously, I think that's exactly the point of the paper. So the interpretation of the results, which I believe fully, are we seeing in Ruth and her colleagues' paper, in Ruth and her colleagues' results, are we seeing a bunch of S&P 500 boards that get completely confused and they just shoot in every direction, G, E, S, just get this over with and let's get to work? Or do they understand perfectly well what these important shareholder proposals are about, and they respond optimally, efficiently, reasonably well? I don't know. This is, I think...
Yeah, there is a lot of work that talks about issue salience. So it depends on the issue, like the salience of the issue for the company, like how material is that issue.
Very good.
So that's,
and connected with that may also be the whole question of purpose that you began also your comments with. And so there are many ways of trying to achieve these collective goals, like climate change, addressing those issues. Shareholder proposal is one. What is the impact of that? So companies are perceiving all these different pressures coming from elsewhere, also regulation, so it's being forced to comply with social norms, etc. And then there's also purpose, right? So there's something that may also come inside out. They have a conviction that they want to serve also stakeholders in society. Benefits and disadvantages, all of these different approaches to address the same goal. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main benefit of having a corporate purpose, and this just came out like maybe, with the Business Roundtable and then with Larry Fink, but it had existed since, Philip Selznick when he wrote a book in 1957. So it's been there, and it has different names, right? You could have different names, like mission but basically, it's nice, and we have organizational psychologists here and other people that know more about this, but I think it's good for a company that everybody is united in the same mission, and that in every layer of the organization, including the stakeholders outside, can relate to that mission, whether the mission is, produce vaccines for a disease, like that there is a clear mission, a clear purpose that the company is trying to fulfill. And then there is work that shows if employees identify with the mission, they'll be more committed to the firm, the company is going to do better. So I think that is the positive thing. The negative side is that it can really, really backfire. One, if it's not genuine, and if it's not internalized by the leaders, by the people at the top. And two, if the lower layers of the organization don't buy into it. So it can really backfire, so it has to be well developed. That's why in my paper I ask, who comes up with that purpose? And who do you involve? And that's also your work, John, on is it inside out, is it from inside out, or is it somebody from outside telling you what you're supposed to do, right? So that would be my answer. But I think it is good to having a purpose, like why are you existing? Why is this company existing? And again, important to revise that, not just have that set in stone.
So how about, there's questions here about pushback and the anti-ESG movement. Any comments on that, about how the way that these goals have been pursued and how they may be more or less likely to generate pushback? Is there a need to also have initiatives that are very much trying to convince rather than simply force organizations to behave well?
So I'll take that question and the former question, because this is exactly where the big divide lies between management and law. And the treatment of purpose and stakeholders and the dealings with stakeholders is fundamentally, conceptually different when you talk to a business administration scholar and to a lawyer. I'll refer to the legal tradition that I know something about, which is the common law tradition. We heard from Ruth just now that purpose is contextual, it's dynamic, it's idiosyncratic, it varies from one firm to another, from one period to another, from different levels of development in the life of a firm, whereas law is universal. Law applies equally to all firms, to all managers in the same way. It cannot be idiosyncratic, dynamic by its nature. So when you look seriously at what company law says, at least in common law jurisdictions, the injunction to the board is keep the company alive. Focus on solvency. That's it. Within this, and that's it. Focus on solvency as much as you can, right? This is business. We take risks on purpose in order to see a return, in order to achieve a purpose, in order to do something. The mission of the organization could be an NGO, doesn't have to be a profit-oriented organization. As long as you keep it solvent, the court will tell you, and has been telling you since the mid-19th century, do whatever you want. Do whatever you see fit, as long as you don't steal, right? That's loyalty. That's off the table right now. Which is to say, lawyers can tell you much and should not tell you too much about a particular purpose, including shareholders versus stakeholders, as long as you keep the company as a legal person alive, meaning solvent. That's it.
Yeah, and then the business people come and tell you how do you do that, like with a strategy, right? How do you accomplish the fiduciary duties that might involve non-financial risk, that they are very, very material to the financial risk, right? So that's why companies need to be careful about environmental damage that could have like a huge financial risk to the company, yeah. So I think we're very complementary in the sense that you set the rule, the big parameters, and then the strategy, we think about how to, the many different ways that we can accomplish that.
Right. I think that some management scholars would like the lawyers to tell them what to do. Just write in the law that we should do this or we should do that, and then I know what my purpose is. We're not going to do that because we can't. Because the tools, the mechanisms that the law implements in order to achieve social regulation are very stable and are universal by design. So it would be pointless, in fact it would be counterproductive for a lawyer or for a court to tell a particular board, just do what those boards have been doing for years now. You don't want to get that kind of advice with punishment, right? So
I think though the civil law, as opposed to the common law, is a little bit more flexible because we have like the codes of good governance. We are a little bit more flexible on the one rule fits all. So there is not like you have to have. So the codes allowed for more flexibility, more period of adjustment, as opposed to the common law.
So what's interesting, I think, is that the law is good to demand certain minimums, but when it comes down to going beyond the minimum, then purpose might be easier to take you there. Now, shareholder proposals generally also have like a one-size-fits-all approach that you start hitting different companies with similar goals. ESG ratings also have a similar ideal. And that's what I find the benefit of purpose, something that comes from within, at least that type of purpose.
Yeah.
But there's a question here also about, accepting proposals. At the very least, companies that accept those proposals, they show that they are engagement, right? So they probably are perceived well, even if they don't comply with the suggestions. Any comments on that? Or?
No, I would totally agree. So the ones that they take it to the board, it's maybe for an opportunity. The ones that they take it to the junta, to the annual general meeting, it's also an opportunity to have that engagement with the shareholders. So I would say that's positive. Remember that many of them get omitted by the regulatory, by the SEC as well. And now they're trying to minimize those and more pass, but yeah.
Very good. And then a question also on board, since that's the overall topic. So all things said, after all of your reflections, what should a board do? What's the responsibility of a board? What's the role of a board in shareholder proposals and also in dealing with these larger challenges of climate change? Any parting thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in Spain, the law was recently changed that the boards have to attend to the shareholder. They have to vote, the activists have to vote, and they have to attend to it. So there is more regulatory enforcement to really address this. So I think boards one of the main roles of boards is to mitigate risk. So they really need to assess if these proposals are material and important for the company and for the reputation of the company. So I think it's the responsibility of the board to address
from the risk perspective.
Yes, from the risk perspective.
And anything from the societal perspective as well, beyond the needs of the corporation. Any other thoughts?
So I think the more fascinating element in Ruth's presentation was the part on the withdrawn proposals. Because this is information that is hardly observed. I mean, the proposals are submitted, but then they're withdrawn. We don't know what goes on there, but something does happen, which I think is fascinating. Going back to your question, this is a mechanism of feedback. Instead of the board just relying on the media and listening to the news, they get a closer connection with a broad set of stakeholders, not just shareholders. I mean, they're all stakeholders wearing hats of shareholders just to get into the AGM hall. So it's a channel of information, and it's a channel of information also for the smaller, more remote, but still important stakeholders. It's a tool. From the point of view, the way I see it, from the board's point of view, it's a tool. It's a tool for collection of information about the world out there, where the world is heading, not just the major investors like the big block holders or the controlling shareholders. If you sit on a board with a controlling shareholder, you may want to go back and tell the family, listen, the world out there is changing. You might feel it's warmer outside. There's a thing about that we need to adjust to. So I see it as it's a functional tool for collection of information more than anything else. The proposals that are omitted by the SEC are usually proposals that try to overreach. They try to tell the board what to do. Shareholders in general are not supposed, they don't have the authority to tell the board what to do. They have the ability to surface certain ideas, and that's about it. And the SEC will trash those that try to overreach.
Very good. So we end here. Thank you very much to both speakers. Thank you also for all the questions. And apologies, I could not ask all of your questions. Thank you.